If you're a machinery manufacturer and you think that the solution to the used equipment market is to just ignore it, I think you're wrong. And Matt Smith thinks you're wrong. And Matt joins me in this episode as a guy who spent years in that world talking about not only how that might be costing you, but the opportunity cost as well, as he's seen companies that have actually built strategically beneficial and incredibly profitable businesses to complement the new machine business by leveraging the used machine world. So listen to this episode, sit back, and I think you're going to unlock some opportunities for additional profit and probably selling some new machines as well.
It's about profit. You're unlocking a wider market by opening up buyers that otherwise wouldn't purchase from you, more sales opportunities to your existing customers, and you're unlocking potential revenue streams ranging from MRO to potentially asset management programs.
The Industrial Growth Institute podcast connects you with the big thinkers, makers, and subject matter experts across all aspects of an integrated B2B industrial revenue growth function. From strategy, board oversight, and transactions through all the phases of manufacturing marketing, the complexities of industrial sales, and the nuances of marketing and sales technology and customer experience, I speak with guests who bring insights, innovative perspectives, best practices, and twists on traditional approaches. Each episode explores high-level thinking and in-the-weeds actionable tactics. If you enjoyed these discussions, then please help me out by liking and sharing the podcast, and especially by leaving a comment and giving a review. So with no further ado, let's jump into this episode. Welcome back to the Industrial Growth Institute podcast, where we talk often about uncomfortable topics that I believe are relevant to industrial manufacturers who are eager to grow in a world where, technology and buyer behaviors are changing so quickly and changing the way that we have to market and sell. And today we're going to talk about one of your very most challenging competitors. It's not the status quo, although that one kills a lot of deals along with buyer indecision. Probably 40 to 60%, according to a lot of research. But today we're going to talk about one that's perhaps even more insidious. And I would call that competitor yourself, and not in some kind of a contrived way. I'll frame it with a quick anecdote. I remember I was active in the printing machinery market during the '01 recession. And I remember learning a very important lesson, understanding the acute challenge that Heidelberg printing press sales reps were up against, selling against their own late model machines in almost every deal, as there were so many liquidations that flooded the market with their own machines. So they were comfortable. They could compete new machine, against just about anybody out there, but they were struggling to try to sell against their own used machines. So that is a topic in my experience that most machinery builders kind of turn their nose up at. But we're going to dig into it today because it's an issue all the time. But when the next recession hits, I think it's likely that liquidations will rise. Used machines will be back on the market, and it's going to be a challenge. So with us today, I think we're really lucky to have a guy who probably understands the used machinery market as well as anyone that I know. Matt Smith has spent nearly 30 years working across technology and manufacturing. He was part of the leadership team that transformed EquipNet from what he calls kind of a struggling .com into the world's leading online marketplace for surplus industrial equipment. As head of enterprise programs, Matt built and ran the global asset optimization systems for Fortune 500 manufacturers and for OEMs, which helped them to unlock, there's a little bit of corporate speak, but unlock the value across factory networks worldwide. He also launched EquipNet's Latin America division, scaling it into the region's largest surplus platform with offices in 7 countries. And when I got to know Matt, it was probably back, I'm guessing, must have been 2010 or something like that. I think he was traveling. It seemed like it was probably 300 days a year. So we'll hear a little bit more from him about international stuff. But since 2018, Matt has shifted gears. He's been serving as the president of AOTCO Metal Finishing. It's a private equity sponsor-backed platform company specializing in precision surface finishing for advanced technology manufacturers. He has led the acquisition and integration of 6 bolt-ons, other finishing companies. He's created this unified operation that supports critical component production for aerospace and defense and life sciences and semiconductors and other high-tech sectors. He's located in Massachusetts. A lot of that high-tech and industrial and medical manufacturing is around there. AOTCO operates 4, I don't know the acronym, NADCAP or NADCAP accredited facilities across the Northeastern United States. And it is as he leads the organization, they're working to modernize a vital but often overlooked industry, transforming what are often fragmented and standalone and siloed job shops into tech-enabled solutions, integrated kind of a partner focused on quality, innovation, and scalable production. So a lot about Matt, but you're going to hear his insights about buying machinery, understanding how manufacturers ought to look at the machinery market, and thinking about used machines as a part of, as opposed to a threat for how they go to market. Even, maybe buying some used equipment to plug holes in some of their own expansions. So we've got an expert with us, and with that, thank you so much for joining us today, Matt.
Hey, Ed, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
All right. I try to call out some buzzwords when I hear them. What in the world is global asset optimization?
Well, yeah. So go back to when we were the early days of EquipNet, right?
Okay.
And the surplus asset market was dominated by equipment dealers who would have an information advantage and just buy equipment for pennies on the dollar, sometimes take it for free, and auctioneers who would just liquidate. And large manufacturers didn't have good visibility or control of their surplus equipment. And what that meant was they were leaving millions of dollars a year on the table. So what we helped
buying
them
machinery they didn't need, or
buying machinery they didn't need, selling equipment for pennies on the dollar, right?
Okay.
Oftentimes one facility would be selling something while another one was buying the same thing. Right?
I've been a sales rep who's been on the winning end of those transactions sometimes.
Yeah. So what we tried to help them do was get visibility of their assets, understand the value, and follow a strategic process to really maximize the value they could recover.
And I'm sure it's going to kind of leach into our entire conversation, but is it possible for you to give some sort of an overview of how the used machine market works? You mentioned the used machine dealers. You mentioned the auctioneers. Can you give us a framework for it?
Yeah. I think if you look at the market today, it's evolved, and there are a couple of marketplaces or more strategic asset vendors that will work with large companies. There's more of an awareness. But with that said, the underlying dynamics are more or less the same, right? You've got companies that have equipment, and then at some point they determine it's surplus. And then there's companies that want to buy that equipment. If a company that has equipment can find a match with a company that needs it, they'll sell it, and that's usually a good outcome because it's a good value for both.
Right.
But if that liquidity in the market's not there, then the company will the owner company will sell the equipment in an auction, or they will sell it to a dealer, and a dealer would typically stock an asset, hold on to it, and then resell it in the future.
Got it.
And then, to the point of your conversation, a newer entrant to this market has been OEMs. And, in some cases, forward-thinking OEMs are beginning to enter that and become players, through pre-owned and trade-in type programs.
And how broad would you say that OEM acceptance is? I mean, I still find it very, very rare, but I live in kind of a narrow niche. Have you seen broad acceptance of that idea, or does it really depend on the philosophy of a particular company owner?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was in the industry, I saw an awareness starting to happen among some more forward-thinking OEMs. But even today, where I'm more of a buyer of both new and used equipment, it frustrates me that those options aren't out there, right? There's capital decisions that we're exploring, and I'd be very interested in de-risking those decisions,
Right.
and connecting with an OEM. And if they don't offer that service, it leaves me in a place where I either have to take a big risk or go in a different direction.
And when you ask, are they disdainful in their response, or are they curious? Geez, tell us why that would be important to you. Which reaction do you get?
Well, I think that depends on the company and how good the salesperson is. I hear both.
Okay. All right. So I can think of various reasons why companies would normally consider used machinery. Certainly one is price. Another, maybe less so now than it was 3 years ago, but lead time. Another might be because they want to kind of do some experimentation. They're thinking about getting into a market or a product, but they don't want to go full in. What are the most common reasons that you think, in your experience, that companies would consider buying used machines?
Yeah, I think you nailed them, Ed. Um, for me, lead time has been number one,
Right.
right? And particularly as we went through COVID, um, and some of the aftershocks, the supply chains from COVID, being able to get equipment that's available now rather than having lead times that at times have extended into years.
Yeah, 18 months, 24 months,
Right.
crazy.
So that lets you, speed up your revenue cycle. Um, the second reason is cost, right? But and sometimes you save money with used equipment, depending on how you approach it. Sometimes you don't. I've got some horror stories about that. But risk is a big one to me, and you can look at the used equipment market and think of it as risky. But going back to the example I was just giving, when I look at the American industrial base today, there's a lot of small, medium businesses that are facing, on the one hand, initiatives to try to reindustrialize, but on the other hand, there's a growing labor shortage, and skilled labor is starting to retire and
Right.
age out, right? And so there's a transition that has to happen there. And a lot of companies like us are looking at automation as one of the potential solutions. But don't have experience in that, right? So what used equipment allows is to kind of get our toes in the water and test out these technologies before we make the major commitment of buying this expensive new technology, right?
And
So I think that is like a big untapped market.
So when you talk about risk, you're not talking so much about the investment risk, the cost risk. You're talking more about just being able to experiment, being able to try things out and seeing how they fit into your workflow, seeing what the production turns out to be, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So like we have processes that I believe can be automated, but they haven't been. And there may be technical challenges, and really the only way to know is to get something and play around with it and see if it works, right? And that's a very expensive proposition if I have to buy new.
Yeah, so let's talk about cost and the savings. I wonder sometimes if the savings really is what it appears kind of when you look at the top line. But if you're installing a machine that requires you to reconfigure your line layouts, or maybe pour some footings, or rerun all the mechanicals, you have to plan around production disruption for installation. You got extra training. You got a new spare parts inventory. Maybe you're saving 50% on depreciation, but I wonder how material that savings ends up being as part of that total package. Do you have any insight?
I think that's a great point. I've seen when companies are experienced and savvy, they can make significant savings, right? But at the same time, I think it's possible to end up spending more on used equipment if it ends up like not meeting your needs and you don't do your diligence, right?
And then that creates this legacy attitude toward it that will never buy it. And that feels like a loss as well.
Yeah, agreed.
In your experience, you mentioned how the F500, these large companies will use it to optimize their global asset base. In terms of spot buying used machines, is it really only small players, or do you see well-funded, larger, profitable companies also buying used machines?
I think when I started in the industry, there was an institutional bias against buying used equipment at most companies. I mean, some always did.
Right.
But generally the attitude was, we're big, we buy new. That changed over time as there was more competition, more pressure on margins. Large companies became more aware and were engaging in that, looking both at reusing their own equipment and tapping into the used market before they spent money on new.
We've touched a couple different ways on some of the bad outcomes, some of the horror stories, if you will. Do you have any kind of personal experience that you can share, either anonymously where you've seen something go horribly bad, or as you've bought used machinery yourself?
Sure. There was an instance where there was some equipment that we acquired that we sent our engineers to look at it. But what everybody missed was that codes had changed and that the equipment was no longer compliant. And so what we thought was going to be a very quick project ended up being one that required an extensive rebuild of the line.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting, and sometimes, I mean, there's such an enormous range of possible considerations. It's really hard to anticipate them all. I want to talk about the OEM perspective. I've long contended, and I haven't found a strong base of support for my theory, but I've long contended that the customer's first purchase, even if it's a used machine, can kind of lock in a permanent incumbent brand advantage. And so I would argue that if manufacturers are worried about their market share, to some degree, solidifying that market share hinges on the purchases of used equipment over which they have no control and they may not even know about. Would you agree?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that it's applicable on both ends of the buying spectrum.
Okay.
So on the front end, there's a number of buyers like the story I was just telling where, we need something. There's an aspirational OEM. And if there was certified pre-owned or a lease to own or demo equipment available, that would de-risk, get us into the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you that if we were to enter that relationship that way, we would stay with that OEM. I'm certain.
Assuming it did what it was supposed to do.
Assuming it worked, right? Not having that option, we're now exploring other avenues, and that may mean that we go down a totally different path and never become a customer, right? And then, I think on the back end, if you think about the used equipment market, there's a brand perception of your equipment on, how well does it hold residual value? How well is it supported in the aftermarket? And those are reasons that, if I'm out buying equipment, those are pretty significant considerations, right? So if I know that an OEM has a trade-in program that de-risks the purchase, and if I know that the equipment will be supported in the aftermarket and has a strong residual value, that's a much easier investment decision for me to justify than something that is where the OEM's philosophy is, hey, I just sell new, and then, once you own it, you're on your own.
It's interesting. All of the money and effort and time and resources that go into creating a brand, the situation you're describing up front could be that with a simple dismissive answer of no, that they lose that brand cachet that they've worked so hard to build because somebody ends up going with a different brand and has a satisfactory experience, and then they're locked in there.
And beyond that, Ed, somebody's going to buy the equipment, right? Somebody's going to sell it. So if you're not the one controlling what happens to your equipment in the aftermarket, you're abdicating that responsibility to someone else who may not have your best interest in mind.
Yeah, I think that's a critical question. I mean, should an OEM set out with the objective of controlling the used equipment of their brand that's on the market? Whether they control the liquidation of it to developing markets or whether they sell it as, their own used machines, should they inventory them? Do they just strive to take them off the street? Do they try to unlock value out of them? I'm sure you've seen a lot of different approaches.
I have. Yeah. And then one other aspect, that I think is important is that there are additional revenue streams that you can gain off of engaging in that market, right? So as companies are looking at used equipment, if you can support them with an assessment, with maintenance and with rebuilding or repairs, installation and commissioning, ongoing service, right? There are revenue streams that you can get off of those assets, right? So, to me, while there's certainly risks and I wouldn't just step in without any forethinking,
right.
I I think that going into this market is a strategic move for OEMs, right? Like it's the difference between being a transactional sale where I sell once and I eat what I kill that day and then I have to go get another one,
Right.
and developing a customer relationship that provides a stream of income from expanding up front to having trade-in cycles on the back end that make my existing customers buy more frequently.
Every machinery company I've ever worked with talks about how the aftermarket, spare parts and service, is vastly higher margin than the machine sales up front. And every one of them complains about the fact that they don't know where their install base is. They don't know why people go and end up buying aftermarket parts instead of OEM parts. So there's this tension. And what you're describing is a way to basically solve for both of those.
Exactly, right? I couldn't have said it better.
So let's go back to lead time. Rentals, loaners, quick delivery, a fleet of machines available for quick delivery. Even so, it could be a discrete solution. Somebody needs something on a temporary basis, or it could be that they've ordered, the lead time is long, may not be exactly configured the way they want, but it's going to work for what they need. And it's going to tide them over so that lead time doesn't become a competitive disadvantage. You've seen companies use that really creatively. You've mentioned how you'd like it as a buyer, but is anyone doing it really, really well?
You mean like as a buyer, companies that are leveraging that to be more agile and speed up their time to market?
So machinery builders that are doing it so well that you as a buyer just feel really, you feel an affinity for them because they're so flexible.
So in our industry today, I have not seen that, but in the past, when I was working on a broader, with life science manufacturers, and there were definitely innovative companies that not only did that, but leveraged those programs to upsell into, subscription streams and asset management programs, right? So I saw some people who I think were best in class at leveraging the equipment market in order to develop deeper, more strategic relationships with their buyers.
And they would they use a platform like EquipNet to keep their ear to the rail and find machines as they came on the market?
Yeah, I think for anyone who is entering the market, there's probably some big advantages to partnering with a third party, which knows the rules and has tools and can kind of guide you in doing that. And that was part of what we did when I was at the company, was to work with OEMs and set up these asset management programs.
Got it. Trade-ins, what percentage, in your experience, what percentage of new machinery builders do you think have some sort of a formal trade-in program?
Certainly less than half, and probably less than a quarter, right? Like
Wow.
I don't.
I'm asking you to guess.
Off the top of my head, I'm sort of guessing, but
right.
Just anecdotally, what I observed was, if you thought about the OEM space, there were there was like the most strategic OEMs I was talking about. Then there was a set of OEMs that was very active in the market that would kind of buy, resell.
Right.
And then there were some that would occasionally, support transactions. And then, at least half that would just say, hey, that's not our business. We want to stay focused, just selling new.
So set up a few Google alerts and have a storage trailer out back and maybe buy something on an opportunistic basis. How large would you say a company needs to be in terms of annual sales or something before it becomes advantageous for them to really structure that kind of a third-party arrangement that you talked about?
Well, I think any size company could potentially benefit from it. And generally those relationships are success based, right? So most of your cost is just going to be in the setup. And but with that said, I would look at market liquidity, right? Like if you've only sold one piece of equipment, there's a pretty small market for that. So what is your installed base, and what's the turnover of that on the secondhand market?
And how about taking a different approach? How about having some frameworks or a guide or even coaching to help if a buyer's coming to you to buy a new machine, to help them rather than you buy their used one for whatever reasons you might not want to, actually coach them through the process of using a platform to sell it themselves instead of just saying, hey, figure it out. We don't want to waste our time. Have you seen anyone doing that?
Yeah. So I've seen, well, first of all, I think the platforms do a pretty good job of coaching buyers and using them. And that's probably the best path for most buyers.
Okay.
There are organizations, consultants that can help to, if you are a little bit more on the self-service side and you want to just learn the rules and not get taken advantage of, there's definitely more strategic ways to approach that market. And maybe I can provide you with some suggestions we could put in the show notes.
Sure.
On where that could be.
Cool. I think a lot of times salespeople hope that by not mentioning a topic, somehow it's never going to occur to their buyer. And so they lose the chance to have that conversation in person. So this conversation about used equipment, is it happening as part of virtually every conversation about buying machinery? Do you think salespeople are negligent if they fail to address it through their questions?
That's a good question. As somebody who came up through sales, I don't know that I would needlessly bring up objections that I didn't think were going to arise on their own.
Mm-hmm.
Although, you might want to suss it out if you thought it was a possibility. But certainly, if you're seeing some resistance, I think it's something that I would want to float out there as a potential solution if I thought I saw a problem with a sale that somebody was resistant to the price or they were perceiving too much risk, right? Like I would definitely want to ask about that. And I'm sure that many companies are out there, we're all, have Google, and it's not too hard to go out and try to find who's selling this equipment. And I'm sure that's part of the process to go look for, is that available on the secondhand market? So right. You'd be remiss not to at least have it in your mind.
Right. Along the way, you've accumulated some really interesting, what I would call kind of complementary perspectives, including international. You've done a lot of work internationally, particularly in Latin America. What do you think that industrial manufacturers tend to misunderstand the most about selling globally?
Yeah, I think, particularly in the United States, there tends to be a more insular domestic focus sometimes, right? Like we think of this as the market, and there can be quite compelling opportunities both for new and used equipment in international markets. So I certainly personally would be looking to those markets if I had. I think throughout my career, international expansion has played a pretty key role in our growth, and oftentimes can be at a higher margin and preferable market conditions to dealing in versus dealing in a very competitive U.S. market or European market. Yeah.
I'm thinking at the intersection of international and used machines, a couple interesting questions. Number one, if somebody in the U.S. is selling equipment that goes into a market where there's a lot of imported machinery competition, I mean, high quality stuff, the German, Italian, Japanese, that kind of equipment, do you think that tariffs on incoming new machinery is likely to ratchet the used machine competition as people look for machinery that's already here, that is from those companies and is available without tariffs?
Yeah, I mean, economically, I think that just makes sense, right? Like if the cost of this goes up and something's already here, it becomes more advantageous to consider a used solution.
And then the other side to that is the international opportunity to get rid of inventory. I hear from a lot of manufacturers that the machines that they might take back in trade are too old. They don't have the current servo configurations. They're not up to the contemporary expectations and standards for what people want to buy. So they hesitate to take them in trade because they don't know what they're going to do with them. It feels like selling them internationally into developing markets could be a great way to do that. Is that something that the platforms are set up to help them do as well?
Yeah, I think you've seen, with the platforms, a pretty heavy international expansion, realizing precisely that, right? That demand patterns change by region. Um, and, a machine that in one region is no longer economically viable may make sense if you move to a different region where the labor costs are different right?
Thinking about that international work, all the travel that you are doing, and now your role as a CEO of a sponsor-owned company, there's a lot of stress that accumulates over the years. And I don't know anybody that's figured out how to completely counter the stress, but I'm always fascinated by what tricks people have. How do you try to manage
Well, Ed, that's a great question.
it? Without a good answer from anyone.
A couple things. First, I've always tried to keep, personal priority. As much as I focus on business and work on the business, there are certain personal priorities that are inviolable, right? Like I don't miss my kids' birthdays. I don't miss my anniversary. Try to be there for the important moments because, at the end of the day, that's what matters in life, right? I've tried to, keep up a good fitness routine. When you're traveling a lot, it's pretty easy to start living the good life, right? And so, having a degree of moderation and making the extra effort to take care of yourself, I think pays dividends. Um, I personally enjoy spending time outdoors and, just getting away and unplugging periodically. It feels like you're always on in today's world. So if you can get away from that, even for a couple of days, it does a lot.
I remember at one point you told me, I think you took a trip to Iceland in the middle of winter, like the winter solstice or something like that with a 4-hour day.
That was a lot of fun.
Wow.
It was to go see the Northern Lights and, it's a different world when you go there in the winter.
Right. So, as a Portco CEO, you're working in a very much more structured framework in terms of thinking about financial decisions than maybe you had in the past. How has that shaped your thinking about business as a result?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of benefits to, needing to stick to a more structured format, right? Like having, it's funny, there's these CEO organizations like Vistage or Katahdin Group, right? They're great organizations that exist because a lot of private companies, the CEO job can be lonely.
Right.
And those organizations provide a board of directors that gives you some accountability and sounding board. So if you're part of a PE Portco, that's part of the equation, right? And while some people may bristle at it, I think it's really helpful to think through decisions and have that accountability. It makes you make this better decision.
And along those lines, how do you look at capital investment differently now than you did before?
Yeah, that's a great. Well, first, I'm in a much more capital intensive industry than I was before, right? When we were in an online marketplace and software provider, most of the investment was development, and now we're building a new state of the art building here in Billerica, Massachusetts, and that's a whole different level of capital investment, right?
Sure.
So what we've learned on that is that you really first need to be pretty disciplined about doing your due diligence and thinking through. I think there's controls that need to be in place for making the decisions and then making sure that everything turns out financially the way you expected and doesn't spiral out of control on the cost, right?
Right. And how about coming back a formal process to make sure that the outcome, the benefit, whatever reason you bought it, is actually being realized as well?
Yeah, exactly. So we that's a key part of what we do is we document what our assumptions are, and it's not just the final result that you want to check, but you want to have milestones, progress data, because I think one of the dangers as you get into these bigger capital projects is that things can incrementally build and you don't catch it until it's too late, right? Like a frog in boiling water, right?
Right. And when you look at acquiring some kind of equipment, I mean, I'll use I would categorize you as a machine shop, although I understand it's much more sophisticated than that. But that in that context, I think of IMTS. As you're looking at new machinery, would you wait for the biennial cycle to go to IMTS to see people in person, or would you make the decision kind of whenever it's compelling from a business perspective?
I'll tell you what we've actually done, which is both.
Okay.
Right. So I have specifically gone to trade shows to look at equipment and engage with vendors who can help us to solve specific problems and design systems that we're scaling up in the new facility. And at the same time, as there have been more urgent problems that have come up afterward, we haven't waited for the trade show, but we've engaged directly with vendors and gone out to visit and done on-site testing in order to, accelerate that decision process.
So it sounds like you almost split it into R&D. We have an aspirational goal of improving this. Help us understand how you could help us do it, as opposed to I've got a problem I got to fix now.
Yeah, I think both.
You've made a number of acquisitions, bolt-ons. I think 6 of them or something like that. Organic growth remains a huge lever in the value creation, though. I mean, inorganic, that playbook is fairly well understood. Organic is a much harder nut for most porcos to crack, in my experience. How have you seen industrial sales evolving over the last 10 years?
Well, you're asking about the sales process? Or are you asking about,
the way buyers behave, the way buyers research, what AI is doing, how the internet's changed it, how the sales process needs to adapt, anything that you think is relevant?
Yeah. So first, I think our experience is slightly different based on the very specialized capabilities that we have. We're fortunate that as we kind of grow our capabilities, there's a fairly ready demand base for that, right? Okay. But in general, when I think, whether at Otco or previous life, I do think there's been a lot of changes in the ways that companies approach buying. Historically, you would, as you said, there's trade shows and it would be very sales driven, and there would be an information asymmetry, and the OEM would tend to have the information advantage. And in today's world, I think that's totally shifted. A lot of that shift happened with Google, and now as you have AI, it's a totally different world. I'm sure you do like I do, right? But any major decision I'm making, I'm conducting pretty thorough analysis and research, leaning heavily on AI tools, among other things, to make sure I'm well informed.
And I also find it's really helpful to challenge my thinking. So not only to shape the thesis and refine the thesis, but then to say, all right, what am I completely missing? What blows this up that I'm not even thinking about?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's an invaluable part of it. And I think that's going to continue to accelerate, as more people adopt it and as the technologies get smarter. Right.
Let's talk about sales karma. That's a topic that I kind of come back to periodically. I think that companies create sales karma. So in other words, if they're condescending towards sales reps who are contacting them, and then they turn around and bitch about the fact that people don't treat their sales reps very well, I think, in some ways, they've probably created that situation for themselves. It strikes me that there's a parallel for companies who insist they only sell new machines, but who then will turn around and consider buying used machines for their own operation. It's kind of a philosophical, I guess, sort of a question, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting take. I hadn't thought of it in quite those terms. But, to go to the concept of a karma, right? I do think there's something to that, right? I think, first, the way that you treat your employees comes through. And the way you think about it really informs the way you think about your customer base, right? So going back to this whole equation, am I thinking about just having an arm's length transactional relationship where it's a one-shot deal? Or am I trying to build a deep, strategic, long-term relationship that arcs over time and takes the buyer on a journey from the early days when they're starting to explore the technology to when they're big and they're upgrading, and I can, provide, potentially subscription-based services and new equipment sales to them, right?
Sure.
So I do think that that attitude bleeds through from the top, and I think it is important to practice what you preach, right?
There's another theory that I have, and I'd be interested in your insights on this one. This has to do with what I believe is the growing risk aversion. The Jolt Effect book by the guys that wrote The Challenger Sale, I think, made some very compelling arguments based on research around buyer indecision and risk aversion. So I think that often competition includes the status quo, and it's complicated by this rising buyer indecision. So then as I start to think about it, I wonder whether if part of the indecision is based on, geez, I'm going to put this much money into the machine. What if it's a mistake? I think people tend to assume that that total investment is the potential loss. If there's a good liquid market for used machines and they turn around a year later and they say, you know what, this just was not working for us. We learned some important things, but it wasn't the right decision. They've potentially, maybe they're going to take a 30 or 50% haircut on depreciation, but it's not the actual full cost of the machine. It's a partial cost of the machine. You talked earlier about risk aversion. Do you think there's any merit to this argument?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right on the money, Ed. If I if I'm a buyer of equipment, there's a lot I gave you that example, right? Like there's a lot of risk for us, and if you can de-risk that decision, whether by lowering the entry cost or by reducing the penalty by giving me a trade-in or a high residual value so that my net exposure is lower, that can make it much easier for me to make an investment decision that I would not have made.
So you consciously think through,
world, and I also think you're right about the world becoming more uncertain, right? Like whether it's tariffs or the policy. I mean, the changes in policy have accelerated,
right?
The changes in technology have accelerated,
and the magnitude of changes.
It's hard to stay on top of all that. So the more as a seller that you can reduce buyer risk, the better position you'll be in.
Got it. You've also got a different view now into the machine builder world as a supplier to some of them. I know a lot of your stuff goes into other applications, but I assume that you've got some machine builders. How do you understand the machine builder business model better or differently now that you're actually a supplier to them?
Well, for starters, not only are we a supplier to them, but I think we're a supplier to the majority of their customers.
Okay.
Right. We share a customer base, and the companies that are using CNC machinery are the ones who also use our services, right? And so as I look across that market, like I said earlier, I think there are structural changes underway, driven by changes in the labor force and this push to reindustrialize and the pull of technologies that are creating opportunities. And I think that smart OEMs are the ones that are going to figure out how to serve those needs, right? By de-risking, by building deeper relationships. So I think this topic is very, very relevant in light of that.
And sitting on the side of the conference table that you sit on now, do you have any advice for capital equipment manufacturers on how they balance their decisions around outsourcing versus insourcing machining and component manufacturing?
Outsourcing versus insourcing. So that's a tough question, right? Like we've gone through that ourselves as we've gone through, very high organic growth periods. There've been times when there's certain processes that we've outsourced. And I think the balance there is how well can you keep quality control? So I think there's a cost element,
Right.
and a quality and service element, right? And then just the logistics of managing a network of outside, there's just because you outsource it doesn't mean it's not work for you. Somebody's got to kind of manage that relationship.
Right.
But on the flip side, I think that the more agile you can be, I mean, we see this in our own industry. A lot of these legacy industrial businesses are operating in decades in the past.
Right.
And the rules that worked decades in the past don't work today. And just like technology has made the world go faster, in the software sector, I think the same thing's happening here. And if you can move fast and be agile, or if you can help your customers move fast and be agile, that's what's going to make you win.
There certainly is there's a whole cadre of manufacturing bros on Twitter that are, carrying on about the reindustrialization, how they're cutting edge and what they're doing and how they're changing things. If you apply some sort of a correction factor to some of the rhetoric, even so, I think there is a lot of inertia, and it's going to be challenging for some of these very traditional companies.
Yeah, it's funny. I've spent most of my career kind of, between technology and manufacturing and trying to challenge, and rethink the way businesses happen. And two things with that. First, I think they're absolutely right. There are major opportunities, and that is the future. And then to your point, I think people totally underestimate the complexity and the risks, and something that seems very straightforward can end up being much more complicated than you think it should be.
Well, the stuff that you guys do, there is so much art involved in it. It seems simple. You're dropping a piece of metal into some liquid to coat it, but the complexity of getting that done right with consistent thicknesses and without the extra stuff hanging on and all the different terms and technologies and criteria that you have, it really is very complex stuff that depends on people having an instinct and huge amounts of, say, tribal knowledge that's accumulated over years.
Absolutely, right. And so first, you're absolutely right. In our industry, it has, it seems simple. I'm going to dip some parts, people say, right? But it has an enormous complexity. And if you look at the variety of just different parts that come in and the condition they're in, and then how you have to clean them and the different processes. And, we process millions of parts a year, and they all go through different paths through our facility. It's an extremely complex operation. Especially when you're doing the job shop type work that tends to be smaller batch, high variety, right?
Right.
And so historically, that has depended on having key operators who are seasoned and have learned through decades of experience. And part of our acquisition strategy, frankly, has been to acquire in that kind of expertise. So we've built up this cadre of experts who the dream team of electroplating and anodizing. But that in the long run, eventually those people retire. And the challenge is, how do you take these little nuances and snap decisions that people make and download it from somebody's brain who really, they're not really brought up as teachers, they're brought up as artists, right? And you have to get that out of their brain and get it into a system and pass it on to the next generation.
And sometimes it's just instinct. You know it when you see it. So how do you pass that on to the generation?
Yeah. Well, that's been one of the big things we've worked on. Yeah,
I think it's important. This has been a great conversation. How do folks get in touch with you?
Sure. You can reach out to us you can reach me through Otco. So www.aotco.com. And we can put a link to my LinkedIn in the profile.
Good. And, so give us a pitch for Otco. I guess I said it wrong at the beginning. Otco. Otco is the way we ought to say it.
That's a litmus test of how long you've known the company.
Tell us who your ideal customer is, so people listening would know whether they should reach out to you.
Yeah. So we work in the specialty surface finishing space, which is basically electroplating, anodizing, doing electrochemical processes to finish components for advanced technologies. And what we really specialize in is first solving problems, right? So if somebody is developing a new part or a new component, and they want to figure out how to handle the finishing and design for manufacturability, or if they have a problem with an existing process that they're looking to troubleshoot, we have a core competency in working through those kind of problems and helping generate solutions that are going to achieve the client needs. Second, we are not the people who will do millions of zinc screws for Home Depot, right? We're not a commodity producer. We focus on high spec, advanced technology industries. And really, if it's critical components that either need very precise finishing, selective finishing that have one area or another, or just jobs that are extraordinarily important or sensitive and need to be done right and done on time, that's what we do.
Got it.
And lastly, just kind of differentiating from, this is an industry made up of job shops, and they tend to have sort of a specific niche and work on more of a transactional basis. And we're different. We've gotten to a scale now where we have a very broad set of capabilities and the ability to run from, R&D pilot to normal production to full-blown contract manufacturing, or even, dedicated factory programs. And so, we tend to see ourselves as being long-term solution partners to help our clients achieve their needs, which I think a lot of companies are looking for. And that would be a good client for us.
And are your customers nationwide, or are they concentrated in New England?
Yeah, we work. We work nationwide, very heavy with both the primes and the different sub-tier manufacturers in aerospace, defense, life science, energy, semiconductor, and other advanced tech industries.
All right. So shifting back to used machines, what resources can you recommend to people if they're intrigued and they say, geez, maybe we're missing the boat. Maybe we need to have a holistic plan for all of these reasons that we've talked about. How would they learn more about the used machine market?
Yeah. I'll tell you what, Ed, I will give you a list of a couple of resources that we can put into the show notes.
Right.
And that would be, my recommendation would be to reach out to a company that is, as you're getting your feet wet, I think you want to have somebody who can be your guide and help you kind of learn the rules, because there is an information asymmetry in this industry, and, you can make mistakes if you don't know what you're doing, right? But then as you gain competence, then I think it's something that people can do on their own. So I can give you a list of some resources that I think would be helpful.
Yeah, that'll be good. I'll drop them in the show notes. So we've bounced around a lot, from selling used machines, buying used machines, selling internationally, machine shops, coatings, all kinds of stuff, portfolio companies and private equity. Give us 3 minutes to wrap up what you think machinery companies really need to understand about how to leverage the used machine market rather than to fear it.
Yeah. Look, I think OEMs should look at the market, and they should I think they should take a very serious look at engaging with it for two reasons. So one is control, like we talked about, right? You want to control the buyer experience, you want to control your residual values, and you want to control your relationships with the buyers so that before they engage with you to when they're larger, you're the one who is giving them the options. And second, I think it's about profit, right? You're unlocking a wider market by opening up buyers that otherwise wouldn't purchase from you. You're unlocking more sales opportunities to your existing customers by having the ability to trade in and upgrade sooner than they would. And you're unlocking potential revenue streams ranging from MRO services to potentially asset management programs. And if a company is going to engage in that, my recommendation to them would be, like, first, I think you should try to gain an understanding of the market before you just jump in. And that means doing a bit of homework, trying to understand, what's happening with your equipment and competitors' equipment on the secondhand market, and look into engaging a third-party company who can help guide you and help you to set up something that will work for your specific needs.
That's a great wrap up and great insights. And I know this isn't your primary gig anymore like it used to be. So I'm especially grateful that you're willing to visit and spend some time talking about this because you get so much knowledge, even though it doesn't necessarily help you so much today. Thank you, Matt.
No, I appreciate it, Ed. It's a good throwback Thursday for me. Relive those days. Good to see you and good to talk about that industry. So,
and thank you so much, everyone, for listening and watching. Be sure you probably have provoked some strong ideas. Drop them in comments, like and share the episode, and be sure to come back and subscribe. Thanks for listening and watching to the Industrial Growth Institute podcast.